The call went straight to voicemail on the second ring, just like it had every Tuesday for the past 4 months. I sat in my truck outside the new commercial site, engine idling, staring at the screen until it went dark. On the passenger seat sat the envelope I'd mailed to Ethan's apartment, a check for $5,000 with a short note apologizing for missing his graduation, marked "Return to Sender" in his neat, deliberate handwriting. I told myself he was just busy starting his life, that 23-year-olds didn't answer their father's calls when they were building a career. But as I looked at that unbroken seal, the silence in the cab felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. "He doesn't want your money, Michael," Laura had told me the night before, her voice completely devoid of anger, which made it worse. He never did. I smoothed the corner of the envelope, trying to make sense of it. I'd spent 20 years growing Carter Construction so Ethan would never have to worry about his future. Every missed dinner and 80-hour workweek was supposed to be proof of how much I cared. But sitting in the fading light with a check my own son refused to touch, I was starting to realize that the bill for those years was finally coming due. I put the truck in gear and drove back toward the main office on 4th Street. The late afternoon sun hit the dust-covered windshield in long, harsh streaks. On the passenger seat, the white envelope sat like a brick, $5,000. To me, it was a rounding error on a bid estimate. To Ethan, who was working 44 hours a week for a mid-sized framing contractor on the east side, it was probably 4 months of rent. But he hadn't even opened the flap. He'd seen my name in the top left corner, picked up a black marker, written those 3 words across the front, and dropped it back in the mail. When I arrived at the yard, the crew was already packing up for the day. Electric saws were winding down, heavy boots were clanking against the steel beds of the pickup trucks, and Greg, my general foreman, was standing by the job trailer with a clipboard under his arm. "Hey, boss," Greg called out as I killed the ignition. "We got the steel delivery confirmed for the Miller project tomorrow at 7. You gonna be on site to inspect the welds, or do you want me to sign off?" "I'll be there," I said, stepping down onto the gravel. "Thought you were taking the afternoon off," Greg said, eyeing me over his coffee mug. He'd been with Carter Construction for 12 years. He was one of the few people who knew how many hours I poured into the business, because he'd been standing right beside me for half of them. "You find him?" I reached through the open window of my truck, grabbed the returned envelope, and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. "He was working." Greg nodded slowly, not pressing. "Kids at 23. They got their own ideas about how the world works. Give him time." "Time isn't the problem, Greg," I murmured, turning toward my office door. Inside, the room smelled of blueprint ammonia, old coffee, and wet sheetrock. It was the smell of my entire adult life. For 25 years, this 400-square-foot modular office had been my sanctuary. When my marriage with Laura started falling apart 8 years ago, I spent 16 hours a day in this chair. When the bank nearly foreclosed on our second yard during the housing dip, I slept on the worn leather couch in the corner. I had built an empire out of 3 second-hand pickup trucks and a second mortgage, and I had done it all with the absolute conviction that every sacrifice was a deposit into my son's future. I sat down at the heavy oak desk, pulled the envelope from my pocket, and laid it flat beside my desk calendar. May 18th was still visible under a faint blue highlighter stroke 4 months prior. Ethan's commencement, 2 p.m. Crossed out over top of it, in thick red ballpoint, were 3 words. Vance Contract Emergency. I leaned back and closed my eyes, remembering that afternoon with a clarity that made my throat feel dry. It had been 85 degrees on the day of Ethan's graduation. I had my suit hanging from the hook behind the cab seat of my truck, ironed and ready. I'd bought Ethan a tag-along gift, a pristine, silver-faced chronograph watch with his initials engraved on the back. It was sitting in a velvet box in my glove compartment. At 11:30 a.m., 90 minutes before I was supposed to leave for the university stadium, the site supervisor from Vance Developments called my mobile. The foundation pour for a 12-story commercial build. The biggest contract Carter Construction had ever landed had hit a catastrophic snag. A concrete transit mixer had broken down right over the primary rebar grid, and 50 yards of quick-setting mix were curing in the hot sun where they shouldn't have been. If we lost that pour, we lost the contract. If we lost the contract, the 30% expansion loan I'd taken out in January would have defaulted by the end of the quarter. "Just go to the stadium, Michael," Laura had pleaded when I called her from the site, my boots covered in gray slurry, sweat pouring through my dress shirt. "He's been looking for your car in the lot for an hour. He saved a seat in row C. He has the ticket in his hand." "Laura, if I leave right now, I lose $400,000. I had yelled over the roar of the backup pump trucks. "Do you understand what that means for us? For Ethan's future? I can pay off his entire college debt with the margin on this build. He doesn't care about the margin, Michael," she shouted back, her voice breaking over the static. "He wants his father in row C. Tell him I'll meet you both at the restaurant at 6, I said, wiping concrete dust from my eyes. "I'll hire a private room at the steakhouse downtown. I'll hand him the watch then. I'll make it right." "Don't bother coming to the restaurant," she had said softly, and then the line went dead. I didn't make it to the restaurant at 6. I was at the site until nearly midnight, pressure washing slurry off the footings with a hand hose, my hands raw and bleeding through my work gloves. When I finally got home, I left the silver watch on the kitchen counter with a check for $10,000 wrapped around the box. The next morning, the watch and the check were gone, but so were Ethan's remaining clothes from his room. He hadn't left a note. He hadn't left a mess. He had simply packed his duffel bags, dropped his house key on the island, and walked out. The vibration of my phone on the desk brought me back to the present. I picked it up, half hoping it was Ethan, but the caller ID showed Laura's name. I answered on the second ring. "Laura, did you get the letter back?" she asked quietly. I stared at the white paper on my desk. "Yeah, half an hour ago." There was a long pause on the line. I could hear the faint sound of wind chimes in the background, the ones I had hung on her back porch 12 years ago, when we still thought we could make things work. "I told you not to mail it, Michael," she said, her voice gentle but unyielding. "You can't write a check to fix a hole you dug with your absence." "I was trying to help him," I said, my voice rising defensively before I could stop it. "He's living in a rundown 2-bedroom on the east side with 3 roommates, Laura. He's working for Miller Construction as a site hand making $22 an hour. He graduated with a degree in construction management. He could be running a crew for me tomorrow. He could be driving a company truck, making double what he's making now. He doesn't want your company truck, Michael," Laura said. "He wants a father who knows what his voice sounds like when he isn't placing an order." I did everything for him. I slammed my hand against the arm of my desk chair. Every hour I worked, every weekend, I wasn't there. It was so he wouldn't have to start at the bottom like I did. Do you know what my dad gave me when I turned 21? A pair of worn-out work boots and a bill for room and board. I built this company from nothing so Ethan wouldn't have to struggle. "No, Michael," Laura said, her tone sinking into a quiet, painful certainty that hit me harder than a blow. "You built this company for yourself. You just used Ethan as the reason so you wouldn't have to feel guilty about never coming home." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. I wanted to argue. I wanted to list the sacrifices, the tax returns, the tuition checks, the summer trips I'd paid for but hadn't attended. But the silence on the line was too deep, and deep down, beneath 25 years of pride and ambition, something small and cold began to shift in my chest. Is he okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's tired," Laura said softly. "He works hard. He reminds me a lot of you when we were 25, except he comes home at 5 o'clock every day, sits on his porch, and talks to the people he loves." She paused, letting the contrast sink in. "If you really want to fix this, Michael, stop sending him mail. Stop calling his boss to ask how he's doing. Stop trying to buy his forgiveness." "Then what am I supposed to do?" I asked, feeling completely stripped of the tools I'd used to navigate my entire life. "Just do nothing?" "No," Laura said. "For once in your life, just show up. But don't bring your wallet." She hung up before I could ask what that meant. For 3 days, I tried to focus on work. I tried to immerse myself in the familiar comfort of spreadsheets, concrete estimates, and subcontractor negotiations. But the office felt different now. The framed photographs on my wall, the ones I'd taken over the years, seemed to accuse me. There was Ethan at 10, standing on a framing deck holding a toy hammer, smiling nervously while I stood 5 feet away, talking on a brick-sized cell phone. There was Ethan at 16, wearing his varsity football jersey, holding his trophy alone because I had been stuck at a zoning board meeting across town. Every photo was a testament to the same pattern. Ethan standing in the foreground, and me standing just outside the frame, occupied by something I had convinced myself was more important. On Friday afternoon, I drove over to the east side. I didn't drive my company truck with the prominent Carter Construction logo plastered across the doors. I took my old, beat-up personal sedan that I rarely used. I parked 2 blocks away from the residential restoration site where Laura had mentioned Ethan was working. It was an old 2-story craftsman home that had been gutted by a fire 18 months earlier. A local nonprofit was rebuilding it to serve as a shelter for low-income families. The company Ethan worked for had taken the contract on a tight budget. I stood behind the trunk of a large maple tree across the street, pulled my hat down low, and watched. Ethan was up on the 2nd-story staging, wearing a yellow hard hat and a dusty tool belt. He was carrying a 6-foot level and a bundle of 2x4s. He looked leaner than he had at Christmas, his shoulders broader, his posture carrying the unmistakable fatigue of a man who spent 10 hours a day doing real manual labor. I watched him work for nearly 2 hours. I watched the way he measured twice, the way he paused to check the plumb line, the quiet care he took when fitting a double-top plate into place. He was good. He had an eye for framing that you couldn't teach in a university classroom. He had my hands, my rhythm, my way of wiping sweat off his forehead with the back of his wrist. At 4:30 p.m., the site supervisor whistled for wrap-up. The rest of the crew began tossing their hand tools into job boxes and heading for their trucks, laughing and shouting about weekend plans. Ethan didn't rush. He stayed on the staging, meticulously sweeping up wood shavings, stacking scrap lumber into neat piles near the dumpster, and wiping down his hand tools before locking them in his personal chest. He was the last one on the site. My chest tightened as I watched him step off the ladder. He pulled off his hard hat, wiped his brow, and sat down on an overturned drywall bucket near the front porch, pulling a warm bottle of water from his cooler. I didn't plan it. My mind told me to turn around, get back in my car, and go home to plan a better approach, but my feet moved before my pride could stop them. I crossed the street, my boots crunching softly on the gravel driveway. Ethan heard the footsteps and looked up. For a fraction of a second, his face was neutral, relaxed in the quiet after a long day's work. Then his eyes locked onto mine, and his expression instantly turned to stone. He didn't jump up. He didn't yell. He just took another slow sip of his water, capped the bottle, and set it down on the dirt between his boots. "What are you doing here, Dad?" His voice was flat, devoid of anger, which hurt far more than screaming would have. "I came to see you," I said, stopping 10 feet away. I felt awkward, stripped of my usual authority. I had my hands shoved deep into my pockets so he wouldn't see them shaking slightly. "You shouldn't have," Ethan said, looking down at his dust-covered work boots. "I'm working." "Looks like you're wrapped up for the day," I said, trying for a tone of easy familiarity that failed completely. "Site looks good. Framing on those 2nd-story dormers is tight. Good work on the headers." Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. He stood up, picked up his tool belt, and began wrapping the leather straps around the hammer holsters. "Did you come here to inspect my work, or did you bring another check?" he asked, not looking at me. The words stung, but I deserved them. "I didn't bring a check, Ethan." "Good," he said, swinging the heavy belt over his shoulder. "Because I don't need your money, and I don't need your advice on how to build a header." "Ethan, please." I stepped closer. lowering my voice. Can we just talk for 5 minutes? Just 5 minutes. I'll buy you an iced tea, or we can just sit right here on the porch. Ethan stopped. He turned to face me fully, his eyes narrowing. The resemblance to Laura in that moment was striking. The same quiet, immovable dignity that had made her walk away from our marriage when she realized I was never going to truly be home. Talk about what, Dad? Ethan asked quietly. Talk about how busy you were on May 18th. Talk about how the Vance pour was worth more to you than sitting in a folding chair for 2 hours to watch me walk across a stage. It wasn't just a pour, Ethan, I blurted out, the old self-defense mechanisms kicking in automatically. It was a $400,000 contract. If that concrete had cured in the grid, Carter Construction would have lost its line of credit. I could have lost everything. You did lose everything. Ethan's voice finally cracked, the flat wall of indifference dropping for a split second to reveal the raw, jagged wound underneath. You lost me. You lost Mom. You lost every single memory that mattered because you were too busy making sure your name was painted on the side of a building. He took a step toward me, pointing a dusty finger at my chest. Do you know what I did on my graduation day, Dad? I sat in that staging area with 500 other kids. Every single time a dad walked past row C carrying a camera or a bunch of flowers, I looked up thinking it was you. I held that extra ticket in my pocket until my palm was sweating through the paper. I called your phone 6 times, and when my name was called and I walked across that stage, I looked into the crowd and I saw Mom sitting there by herself, holding the seat next to her open with her purse. He swallowed hard, his throat working as he fought to control his breath. You think a check for $5,000 fixes that? You think buying me a watch or paying my rent makes up for 23 years of looking for you in the stands and seeing an empty seat? I stood there, speechless, the blood rushing in my ears. The air between us felt heavy, suffocating. All the logical justifications I'd built over 2 decades, the college funds, the house payments, the financial security, evaporated like mist in an oven. I thought I was taking care of you, I managed to say, the words sounding hollow and pathetic even to my own ears. You were taking care of yourself, Ethan said, his voice dropping back into that terrifyingly quiet, steady register. You wanted to be the provider, so you could feel like a hero, without ever having to be a father. A father shows up, Dad. A father sits in the rain at a Little League game. A father sits in row C. A father answers the phone. He grabbed his canvas duffel bag from the porch floor and slung it over his opposite shoulder. I don't hate you, Dad, he added, looking me straight in the eye. I just don't need you anymore. I learned how to live without you a long time ago. You just didn't notice because you were at work. He walked past me, his boots kicking up small puffs of red dust on the driveway. He got into an old, rusty hatchback parked at the curb, started the engine, and drove away without looking back in the rearview mirror. I stood alone in the quiet driveway of the half-built house as the sun dipped below the tree line. For the first time in my 48 years, I had nothing to say, no bid to submit, no contract to sign, and no check to write. I was completely, utterly bankrupt. I didn't go back to the office that night. I drove back to my house, a sprawling 4-bedroom modern build in an upscale subdivision that felt more like a museum than a home. I walked through the dark rooms. The granite countertops in the kitchen were spotless, because I rarely cooked. The second-floor bedrooms were pristine, preserved in the exact state they had been when Laura and Ethan moved out after the divorce. Ethan's old bedroom still had his high school track ribbons hanging from the mirror and his desk light plugged into the wall. I sat down on the edge of his twin bed, resting my elbows on my knees, staring at the floor. Laura's words returned to me, echoing in the quiet room. For once in your life, just show up, but don't bring your wallet. What did it actually mean to show up for someone who had already built a wall high enough to keep you out? How do you rebuild a foundation when the original structure has been thoroughly demolished by years of neglect? In construction, when a foundation settles incorrectly and cracks the frame above it, you can't just slap fresh drywall over the plaster. You have to undergo a process called underpinning. You have to dig beneath the existing footings, hand excavate the unstable soil, install hydraulic piers, and slowly, millimeter by millimeter, lift the load until the building rests on something solid. It's slow, filthy, invisible work. Nobody sees it from the street. There are no ribbon-cutting ceremonies when an underpinning job is finished. You just dig in the dark until the house stops sinking. I spent the entire weekend sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad. I didn't write down financial plans or business strategies. I wrote down dates. October 2011, Ethan's 10th birthday. Missed for concrete bid in Westlake. May 2014, middle school graduation. Left early for emergency sub-meeting. November 2016, state quarterfinals. Arrived at halftime. Spent entire second half on phone in parking lot. June 2019, move-in day at college. Sent 2 company hands in a flatbed truck to move his furniture because I had a site walk. May 18th, 2024, college commencement. Didn't show. By Sunday night, the list covered 3 full pages. It was an audit of my life as a father, and every line item was a default on my primary obligation. On Monday morning, I walked into the Carter Construction main office at 6 a.m. When Greg arrived 30 minutes later, carrying his morning thermos, he found me standing by the main whiteboard in the conference room. I had drawn a line down the middle of the board. On the left side were the 6 active projects we were running. On the right side was a list of responsibilities. "Greg," I said, handing him a dry erase marker. "Starting today, you're taking over as Chief Operations Officer for all field builds." Greg froze, staring at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "Excuse me? You heard me," I said. "You know the subtrades better than I do anyway. I'm promoting you. We'll adjust your salary by 40%, effective immediately, and give you profit sharing on the Miller project." "Michael, what are you talking about?" Greg asked, setting his thermos down on the table. "You've micromanaged every pore, every frame, and every nail in this county for 25 years. You don't let anyone sign off on a footing except you." "That was a mistake," I said quietly. "I need my time back." "To do what? Expand into the northern county?" "No," I said, picking up my hard hat from the desk. "To learn how to dig." The nonprofit site on the east side, the Community Habitat House, was funded by a local church coalition and operated on a shoestring budget. They relied heavily on volunteer labor on Saturdays to stretch their grant money. The following Saturday morning at 6:30 a.m., an hour before the volunteer shift was scheduled to begin, I pulled my old sedan up to the curb 2 blocks down. I was wearing faded jeans, a worn flannel shirt, and a pair of scuffed work boots that hadn't seen a job site in 5 years. In my hand was a simple, heavy-duty leather tool pouch with standard hand tools, a hammer, a speed square, a chalk line, and a tape measure. No power tools, no high-end gadgets, no company logos. I walked onto the site. The volunteer supervisor, a retired carpenter named Artie, with gray hair and thick wire-rimmed glasses, was setting up a folding table with sign-in sheets and cold donuts. "Morning," I said, stepping up to the table. "Need an extra pair of hands today?" Artie looked me up and down, noting the worn boots and the tool belt in my hand. "Ever done framing work before, son?" "A little," I said. "Used to do it a long time ago." "Great," Artie said, handing me a clipboard. "Sign in here. We're putting up interior partition walls on the first floor today. Lots of layout work and nailing plates. You know how to read a blue line?" "I can figure it out," I said. At 7:15 a.m., a battered green pickup truck pulled up to the curb. Ethan stepped out, carrying his lunch cooler and his hard hat. He was working his regular paid Saturday shift as the lead site hand for the contractor overseeing the volunteer crew. He walked past the sign-in table, stopped dead in his tracks, and stared at me. I didn't say hello. I didn't offer a big, emotional smile. I just looked at him, nodded once, and picked up a length of bottom plate timber from the stack. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp, coming up to the edge of the porch where I was laying out studs. Artie looked over from the coffee station. "You guys know each other?" Ethan started, then hesitated, the word catching in his throat. "We know each other." "Great," Artie said, oblivious to the tension. "Michael here signed up as a general volunteer for the full day." "Ethan, since you're lead hand, show him where the layout chalk is, and get those bedroom walls snapped." Ethan stared at me for 3 long seconds. His jaw was set tight, his eyes searching my face for the trick, the grand gesture, the sudden appearance of a film crew or a checkbook. "He doesn't need to be here, Artie," Ethan said, turning to the older man. "He runs a major commercial construction company. He's wasting his time." Artie blinked in surprise. "Is that right?" "I'm not running anything today," I said calmly, looking straight at Ethan. "I'm just a volunteer who knows how to hold a hammer. If you don't want me on your wall, tell me where you want the scrap carried, and I'll haul scrap all day." Ethan's mouth twitched. He looked at the stack of lumber, then at Artie, then back at me. He could have told Artie to kick me off the site. He had every right to. I held my breath, waiting for the rejection I knew I deserved. "Grab the tape," Ethan said abruptly, turning his back on me and walking into the rough-framed living room. 16 inches on center. Don't mess up the layout. For 8 hours, we worked in near-total silence. I didn't try to start conversations about the past. I didn't ask him how his apartment was. I didn't mention Laura, or his future, or his career. I snapped chalk lines where he told me to snap them. I cut 2x4s to the exact lengths he marked. I held the heavy top plates in place above my head, while he drove 16-penny nails into the joists, with rhythmic, practiced strikes of his framing hammer. My 48-year-old shoulders, accustomed to sitting behind a desk for the last decade, began to ache within 2 hours. By noon, my lower back was burning, and my thumbs were bruised from misdirected hammer strikes. But I didn't complain. I didn't take an extra break. When the volunteer lunch was called at 12:30 p.m., I sat on an overturned drywall bucket in the far corner of the yard, ate a cold turkey sandwich I'd brought from home, and drank water from a plastic bottle. Ethan sat 50 feet away on the tailgate of his truck, eating with the other volunteers. He watched me out of the corner of his eye. I could feel his gaze, suspicious, waiting for me to quit, waiting for me to check my watch, drop my tools, and take an urgent phone call. My mobile phone rang 4 times in my pocket that afternoon. It was Greg, with questions about the Miller site. It was subcontractors asking for approvals. Each time it rang, I reached into my pocket, pressed the side button to mute the ringer, and let it go to voicemail without ever pulling the phone out to look at the screen. At 4 p.m., Artie called an end to the workday. My hands were covered in splinters and wood dust, my shirt soaked with sweat, my legs trembling from 8 hours of standing on concrete footings. Ethan stood by his truck, watching the volunteers pack up their gear. I walked over to the tool shed, neatly wiped down the saws and levels I'd used, returned them to their racks, and swept the floor of the hallway we'd framed. As I was walking past Ethan's truck toward the street, he spoke up. "You're going to be sore tomorrow," he said. I stopped, turning to look at him. His tone wasn't warm, but the ice had thinned just a fraction. "I'm sore right now," I admitted, offering a small, tired smile. "Haven't framed a wall since 2010. Ethan looked at my hands, the fresh blisters forming on my palms, the dust ground into the skin around my fingernails. "Why are you doing this, Dad?" he asked, his voice low, free of the anger from Friday. "Is this some kind of game? Prove you can still do real work, so I'll feel bad for not working for you?" "No," I said, stepping closer, keeping my hands at my sides. "I came because you were here, and because for 20 years, every time you asked me to be somewhere, I gave you a check instead of my presence. I can't undo May 18th, Ethan. I can't undo the last 10 years. But I can show up on Saturday." Ethan looked away, staring down the quiet neighborhood street. "One Saturday doesn't change anything," he said softly. "I know," I said. "I'll see you next week." I turned and walked to my car before he could answer. The following Saturday, I was there at 6:30 a.m. Artie handed me a staple gun and insulation rolls. Ethan was installing exterior sheath siding on the south elevation. I worked alongside him all day, holding the heavy 4x8 OSB panels against the studs while he tacked them into place. We spoke only when necessary for the work. Hold it higher, flush on the left, hand me the nail gun. The Saturday after that, it rained. A steady, cold September drizzle that turned the site into a slick, muddy trench. Most of the general volunteers didn't show up. Only 4 of us were on site: Artie, Ethan, a retired plumber named Dave, and me. We spent 5 hours in the unheated, drafty interior, crawling through 6 inches of mud in the crawl space to strap drainage pipes beneath the floor joists. By 2 p.m., I was covered head to toe in yellow clay, freezing, my fingers so stiff from the cold rain that I could barely wrap them around a wrench. Ethan crawled out from under the porch deck, dripping wet, his face smeared with grease. He looked at me sitting in the mud by the foundation wall, shivering, trying to tighten a pipe clamp with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He walked over, sat down in the mud right next to me, took the wrench from my frozen fingers without a word, and finished tightening the clamp himself. When he was done, he sat back against the mud bank, wiped rain from his eyes, and pulled a thermos from his coat pocket. He unscrewed the cup, poured hot coffee into it, and held it out to me. "Drink this," he said. I took the cup. My hands were shaking so hard, the black coffee sloshed over the rim, scalding my knuckles. I took a sip. It was cheap, bitter gas station coffee, but it was the warmest thing I'd ever tasted. "Thanks," I mumbled. We sat there in the mud, side by side, listening to the rain rattle against the plastic sheet windows of the unfinished house. "Why didn't you go home when the rain started?" Ethan asked softly, staring out at the gray afternoon. "You've got a warm office. You've got people you pay to crawl in mud." I took another sip of the coffee, looking down at my filthy boots. Because if I went home, I'd just be sitting in an empty house, thinking about all the Saturdays I spent in that warm office while you were growing up. I said quietly, "I'd rather be freezing in the mud with you than warm anywhere else." Ethan didn't say anything for a long time. The wind blew a sheet of rain through the open porch frame, spraying our faces. "Mom told me you gave Greg control of the field builds," Ethan said quietly. "Yeah," I nodded. 2 weeks ago. Are you selling the business?" "No," I said. "I'm just downsizing my priorities. Carter Construction doesn't need me 16 hours a day anymore. They'll survive if I'm not there. And what are you going to do with your time?" I turned my head to look at him. His profile was framed by the dark, wet wood of the house he was building with his own hands. "Whatever you'll let me do," I said. "If that means hauling scrap on Saturdays, I'll haul scrap. If that means sitting on this porch in the rain once a week without talking, I'll sit right here." Ethan slowly took the empty coffee cup from my hands and screwed it back onto the thermos. He stood up, wiping his muddy palms on his jeans, and reached a hand down toward me. I looked at his open hand. It was broad, calloused, and stained with dirt, the hand of a builder. I reached up, took his hand, and let my son pull me up out of the mud. October came, bringing crisp air and dry autumn days. The Habitat house was nearing completion. The roof was shingled, the dry wall was taped and mudded, and we were beginning the exterior trim and paint work. Over those 6 weeks, something subtle had begun to shift between us. We still didn't have long, tearful, heart-to-heart conversations. We didn't talk about the missed graduation, or the $5,000 check, or the years of empty chairs. But the silence between us was no longer cold. It was the shared silence of 2 men who knew how to work together, who respected the weight of a beam and the precision of a cut. Ethan started asking me small questions about structural engineering, how to calculate floor loads on long spans, how to handle difficult load-bearing conversions in older homes. I didn't lecture. I showed him with a piece of carpenter's chalk on a scrap piece of drywall, explaining the math simply, respecting his intelligence, treating him like a peer rather than an employee or a child who needed fixing. One Tuesday evening in mid-October, my phone rang while I was sitting at home, eating a quiet dinner. I looked at the screen. It was Ethan. My heart gave a sudden hard thud against my ribs. He hadn't called my phone directly since May. I answered on the first ring, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Ethan." "Hey, Dad." His voice was quiet over the line. "Are you busy?" "No," I said instantly, pushing my plate aside. "Not at all. What's up?" I'm looking at a second-hand pickup truck downtown," he said, hesitating slightly. "An old '08 Ford F-150. The guy wants $4,000 for it. I've got 3 saved up. I was wondering." He paused, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to ask me for a loan. My old instincts screamed at me to say, "I'll pay the whole $4,000. I'll buy you a brand new one." I bit my tongue, holding the impulse down with everything I had. "I was wondering if you could come take a look at the engine with me," Ethan finished quietly. "You always knew how to spot a bad transmission." I leaned back against the kitchen chair, closing my eyes, as a sudden wave of heat washed over my chest. He didn't want my money. He wanted my eyes. He wanted my time. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, I said, my voice thick. "Where are you?" I met him in a dimly lit gas station parking lot on Grand Avenue. The truck was a rusted silver Ford with a crumpled rear fender and 200,000 miles on the odometer. The seller was a fast-talking guy in a hoodie who kept talking about how great the cold start was. I didn't say much to the seller. I put on an old pair of work gloves, crawled underneath the front axle with a flashlight, and spent 20 minutes checking the frame for rust, pulling the dipstick to check for milky oil, and listening to the transmission idle. Ethan stood by the driver's door, watching me work. I crawled out from under the truck, wiped my greasy hands on a rag, and looked at Ethan. "Frame is solid," I said. "Transmission is okay, but the rear main seal has a small leak. It'll cost about $200 in parts if you change it yourself. Offer him $2,800. Don't go a penny over $3,000. Ethan nodded. He walked over to the seller, negotiated calmly, and settled on $2,900. He pulled a thick stack of $100 bills, his own hard-earned money, from his pocket and paid the man directly. After the seller drove away in his chase car, Ethan stood by the driver's side of his new truck, keys jingling in his hand. "She's not much," Ethan said, looking at the faded paint, "but she runs. She's a good truck," I said softly. "You bought her yourself. That means something." Ethan looked at the keys in his hand, then looked up at me. Do you want to help me change that rear main seal this weekend?" he asked. "At your shop, if you've got room in the bay?" I looked at my son, standing there in the flickering neon light of the gas station sign, grease on his cheek, wearing a truck he'd bought with his own sweat, asking his father to spend a Saturday in a cold garage fixing a $200 leak. "We'll clear out Bay 1 on Friday night," I said, my voice steady, though my eyes were stinging in the cool night air. "I'll have the jacks ready." Ethan offered a small, genuine smile, the first real smile I'd seen on his face in over a year. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly. He got into his truck, fired up the rumbling engine, and pulled out into the night traffic. I stood in the parking lot, watching his taillights fade down Grand Avenue. I pulled my phone from my pocket. There was an email notification from Vance Developments asking if I was available for a high-level expansion dinner this coming Saturday night. I didn't hesitate. I opened the email, hit reply, and typed 4 words. "I have a prior commitment." I placed the phone back in my pocket, walked to my car, and got in. I wasn't cured. The past wasn't erased. The years of empty chairs couldn't be filled in 6 weeks of volunteer work and a rear seal repair. But for the first time in 23 years, I wasn't running toward a contract or away from my mistakes. I was just a father, preparing to show up on Saturday. Friday night arrived, and Bay 1 of the main Carter construction yard was lit up by 2 halogen work lamps. The heavy hydraulic lifts were silent. The air smelled of gear oil, exhaust, and cold concrete. I was lying on my back on a low creeper beneath the rear end of Ethan's silver F-150, a ratcheting socket wrench in my hand. Ethan was squeezed in beside me, holding an inspection light steady against the exposed drive shaft. "Hold the light higher," I murmured, my voice echoing slightly off the undercarriage. "Right there. See that flange? That's where the housing meets the block." Ethan shifted the beam. "Is the seal shot?" "Worn thin," I said. "It's been leaking slowly for 6 months." "Hand me the 10mm socket." He reached into the tool tray and handed me the socket. His hands were covered in dark grease, his nails stained black around the edges. The same mark I'd carried on my own hands for 30 years. For 2 hours, we worked under that truck. There were no speeches. There was no heavy probing into the past. I didn't tell him how to run his life, and he didn't pretend that 6 weeks of volunteer work on Saturdays had wiped away a decade of missed dinners. But when I struggled to align the heavy tail housing against the crossmember, Ethan didn't wait for me to ask. He simply placed his shoulder against the steel, braced his boots on the concrete floor, and lifted until the bolts slid clean into their sleeves. "Got it," he grunted. "Torque it down," I said, sliding out from under the frame to give him space. 75 foot-pounds. I stood up, wiping my palms on a red rag, and watched him work. He didn't rush. He set the clicker on the torque wrench, applied steady pressure until the steel gave a sharp clack, and then checked the seat twice. He had my patience for mechanics, my refusal to leave a job half done. When he finally slid out from under the truck and wiped his brow with his sleeve, he looked around the silent, empty shop. "You used to sleep on that couch in the office, didn't you?" Ethan asked quietly, pointing through the glass window toward the modular trailer. I paused, the rag still in my hands. "Sometimes, when we were running 3 sites at once back in 2015, Ethan picked up a can of brake cleaner and sprayed down the oil pan. I used to ask Mom why you didn't come home for dinner. She always told me you were building something big." He looked up at the high steel girders of the bay ceiling. "I thought it was a skyscraper. It took me a long time to realize it was just a fence." The word hit me with the quiet weight of an anvil, but I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. "It was a fence," I admitted, looking him in the eye. "I was terrified of going broke like my father did. So I built walls around everything I owned, and I locked myself inside them. I thought as long as the bank account was full, I was doing my job." Ethan set the spray can down on the workbench. "A bank account doesn't sit in the bleachers, Dad." "I know," I said softly. "I know that now." 3 weeks later, on a freezing Saturday morning in late November, the Habitat for Humanity house on the east side was finally ready for its ribbon-cutting ceremony. The nonprofit had invited the neighborhood, the volunteer crews, and the local press for a small dedication on the front lawn. Ethan, as the lead hand for the primary contractor, had been asked to speak briefly on behalf of the build team before handing the keys to the young family who had won the housing grant. At 7:45 a.m., 45 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, my mobile phone rang. I was standing in my kitchen at home, wearing a ironed wool sweater and dark trousers, holding my car keys. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Arthur Vance, the CEO of Vance Developments, the man whose broken concrete mixer had kept me trapped at a job site on the afternoon of Ethan's graduation. I answered, "Arthur, Michael." Vance's loud, booming voice came through the speaker, fast and urgent. "Thank God I caught you. The lead developer on the downtown Civic Center build just lost their bonding company. The municipal board is holding an emergency executive session at City Hall at 9 o'clock. If you can get down here in 20 minutes with your corporate seal and sign the preliminary letter of intent, the $60 million contract is yours. No competitive bidding, just your signature." I stood in my quiet kitchen, looking at the clock on the wall. It was a contract I had dreamed of landing for 15 years. It was the kind of legacy project that would have cemented Carter Construction as the largest independent builder in the state. All I had to do was turn my car toward downtown instead of the east side. "Michael, you there?" Vance pressed. The board chairperson is sitting across from me right now. We need an answer. Old habits, 25 years of deeply ingrained ambition, flared up in my chest like a reflex. My pulse quickened. My mind automatically began calculating margins, equipment schedules, and profit yields. And then I saw the white envelope sitting on my desk calendar, marked Return to Sender. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs completely. Arthur, I said, my voice completely steady, I won't be coming to City Hall. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. What? Michael? Did you hear what I just said? It's $60 million. The mayor is in the room. I hear you, Arthur, I said quietly. Call Greg. He handles our commercial operations now. If he thinks the company has the capacity, he can make the decision. But I have somewhere else I need to be. Where could you possibly need to be at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning? Vance demanded, incredulous. I have a seat reserved, I said. And I'm not going to leave it empty. I hung up the phone, stepped out the door, and locked my house behind me. The front lawn of the Habitat house was crowded with 40 or 50 people when I arrived. Fold-out metal chairs had been arranged in neat rows, facing the newly painted front porch. I walked up the gravel driveway, my hands in my coat pockets. Sitting near the middle row, wearing a dark blue scarf and holding a warm paper cup of coffee, was Laura. She looked up as I approached. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a quiet, searching look. You're early, she said gently. Traffic was light, I replied. Is this seat taken? She moved her purse off the empty metal chair beside her. It's all yours, Michael. I sat down next to my ex-wife for the first time in 6 years. We didn't talk about Vance developments, or the shop, or the past. We just sat side by side in the cold November air, watching the steam rise from our breath. At 8:30 a.m., Artie stepped up to the wooden porch steps and tapped the microphone. The crowd quieted down. He spoke briefly about the hundreds of volunteer hours that had gone into turning a burned-out shell into a home for a young mother and her 2 small children. And now, Artie said, turning toward the doorway, I want to bring up Ethan Carter. Ethan took over as our site hand halfway through the build, and without his layout work and his patience with our weekend crews, this roof wouldn't be over our heads today. The crowd clapped warmly. Ethan stepped out onto the porch. He was wearing a clean jacket, his dark hair brushed back, looking tall and composed. He adjusted the microphone stand, his hands completely steady. He looked out over the small crowd gathered on the lawn. His eyes passed over the volunteers, the church members, the city council representative, and then his gaze landed on the middle row. He saw me. He saw me sitting right beside his mother, my phone dark in my coat pocket, my attention entirely on him. Ethan paused for a brief fraction of a second. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift passed over his face. A sudden softening around his eyes, a tiny release of tension in his shoulders that had been held tight for 4 months. Thank you, Artie, Ethan began, his voice carrying clearly over the crisp morning air. Building a house isn't complicated. You dig a trench, you pour concrete, and you nail 2x4s together until it holds a roof. Anyone with a hammer can do that. He looked back down at the middle row, his eyes locking onto mine. The hard part, Ethan continued softly, is building something that stays standing when the weather gets bad. That takes time. It takes showing up every day, even when you're tired, even when it rains, even when the dirt is cold. You don't build a foundation with words. You build it by staying. When the applause broke out, Ethan handed the keys to the young mother, stepped off the porch steps, and walked through the crowd. He didn't go to his supervisor. He didn't go to the local reporter holding a notepad. He walked straight to the middle row, stopping in front of Laura and me. Laura stood up and gave him a warm, brief hug. You were wonderful, Ethan. Thanks, Mom, he said softly. Then he turned to face me. I stood up slowly. I didn't offer a dramatic speech. I didn't reach for my wallet. I just stood there, looking at my son, feeling the full weight of the 23 years that had brought us to this lawn. Ethan reached into his inner coat pocket. He pulled out a small, square velvet box, the silver chronograph watch I'd left on the kitchen counter 4 months ago, the one with his initials engraved on the back. "Mom kept this in her drawer," Ethan said quietly, holding the box out between us. "She told me I should give it back to you until I was ready." I looked at the silver box, then up at his face. "Ethan, I bought that for you. It was meant to be a gift." "I know," Ethan said. He opened the velvet latch, pulled out the heavy silver watch, and held it out to me. "Put it on my wrist, Dad." My fingers trembled slightly as I took the watch. I reached around his wrist, fitting the leather strap into the steel buckle, clicking the pin into the third hole. The exact fit. Ethan looked down at the watch, turning his wrist over to see the faint, silver sheen in the autumn light. "It keeps good time," Ethan murmured. "It does," I whispered, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't hold down any longer. Ethan looked up, his eyes clear and steady. "Come on, Mom and I are going to the diner down on 5th Street for breakfast. You're coming with us." It wasn't an instant erasure of the past. It wasn't a sudden, perfect fairy tale ending where 20 years of absence were forgotten overnight. But as I walked beside my son toward his old green truck, I knew that the foundation had finally stopped sinking. We had cleared away the decayed wood. We had dug down through the cold mud to the solid stone beneath. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't watching my family from behind a desk or through a windshield. I was standing right beside them, holding a hammer, ready to build whatever came next. Every relationship we break takes time to rebuild, and true forgiveness is rarely earned with an apology or a check. It is earned in the quiet, unglamorous moments when we choose to show up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when we have every excuse to be somewhere else. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to earn back the trust of someone you loved? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more real, deeply human stories about family, redemption, and second chances. Real wealth is never measured by the size of the empire you leave behind, but by the strength of the chairs you didn't leave empty.